Hello and welcome to another National Road Safety Partnership Program webinar, How to Understand Suicide on UK Roads and How We Can Prevent Them, Insights for Australia. Just a bit of origins as to why we're doing this webinar. We have a workshop next week looking at suicide and road transport, so we're really hoping to draw on this webinar today to help inform ourselves ahead of next week's session. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jerome Carslake, there I am, and I manage the NRSPP and its many activities. To find out more, please visit the NRSPP website and register for the newsletter, and you'll be kept up to date about our many activities that are coming up. So, today's session will go for approximately 60 minutes. We have plenty of time for discussion, so we're aiming to have around 45 minutes presentation and 15 minutes for discussion time. We're recording this session today, and it will be shared on the NRSPP website, and everyone will be emailed the link after the webinar, so they can then follow up at their leisure, I should say. Now, one thing we do love is an interactive webinar. As with all of our webinars, this is the device we use. Please enter in your questions, fire them on in, and we'll ask them. We've got a range of different points through the webinar. We'll be holding and asking questions. If it's a burning one, I'll also pose it to our two presenters. So, our presenters today, let's dive into our first one, is David Davis. He's Executive Director for PACS. He has a background in sustainable transport and road safety, public sector scrutiny, planning and research. He's worked in local government and transport consultancies, including 5 years at the Transport Research Lab. In 2003, he moved to the Audit Commission and was subsequently to the UK Parliament House of Commons Transport Select Committee, making many inquiries into road safety, aviation strategy, high-speed rail, national policy reports and bus competition. And he's been Executive Director of PACS since January 2013. Now, David commissioned and oversaw the PACS Suicide on Roads project earlier last year. So, for those of you who don't know about the PACS at all, PACS is a Parliamentary Advisory Council for Transport Safety, and it's a leading UK think tank and an umbrella organisation on transport safety. It was formed in 1982 by the parliamentarians and safety experts responsible for compulsory seatbelt wearing legislation. Its role is to advise Parliament on road, rail, and aviation safety matters. So feel free to check out their websites. And Dave would also like to pay credit to the project funders, the Road Safety Trust and the Safer Road Foundation. Our other presenter, and she'll be the one commencing in a tick, is Jackie. Jackie is Assistant Director of the Samaritans, responsible for its research and policy work. Samaritans is a leading charity for suicide prevention in the UK and Ireland. It takes over 5 million calls for help every year with 20,000 volunteers. That's a massive amount. Samaritans has a program of research that seeks to add the knowledge base around suicide and suicide prevention. Use this to influence change. So welcome to you both. Now,
good evening, Jerome, everybody.
Good evening, David. Good evening, Jackie.
Hi.
Hey, now I'm going to pass over control to you, Jackie.
Thank you.
Here we go.
Hi, everyone.
All yours, Jackie.
Brilliant. Well, good evening. It's morning here, so we're just having our first cups of tea of the day, but it's a real pleasure to be with you all. As Jerome says, I'm responsible for Samaritans research and policy work, and Samaritans is the UK and Ireland's largest charity working on suicide prevention. We have a helpline that is open every day, all day, every day of the year. And we have 20,000 volunteers who run that helpline for us, who are absolutely extraordinary people. But we don't just do that. We also have a range of work in the community. So outreach work, doing a whole range of things, for example, in prisons, in schools. And the bit of the world that I'm responsible for Samaritans is all of our policy work, whereby we produce research reports, we talk to government, we try and really change suicide prevention policy in the UK and Ireland, as well as having campaigning to try and engage the public in our work. So that's a little bit about us. I thought I'd begin by just setting some context really about suicide over here. So we have nearly 6,000 people who die a year by suicide here. 3/4 of those are men. Of those, it's really middle-aged men, which are the highest risk group. Hopefully you can see that slide there, which is just showing the different rates for the different age groups. And, you know, there are a whole series of risk factors for suicide. So one of the things about suicide in the UK is that only 1 in 3 people are in contact with mental health services in the year before they die. So 2/3 of people have got no contact with mental health services over here. 1/3 of those may have been in contact with their GP in the month before their death, but that could have been for anything. We don't know why they were in contact with them. And 1/3 of those aren't in contact with any services at all. So for us, it really is a public health issue. Some of the other things we know, for example, over here, we know that unemployed people are at higher risk. We know low-skilled workers are at higher risk. We know construction workers are at higher risk. So it's really an inequality issue. So if you are poor and you are male and you're living in one of the poorest areas of our country, then you're 10 times higher risk of suicide than a male who is living in one of the most affluent areas of the country. And that's really important for us, understanding those sorts of things when we're thinking about how to tackle suicide. So just to give you a very brief policy context here. So we have a cross-government suicide prevention strategy for England. We have a 10% reduction target in that strategy. And England is split up into 152 local areas. And all of those areas are supposed to have a multi-agency suicide prevention plan in place. Multi-agency means that it's supposed to have all the different bits of the local government involved, as well as the voluntary sector, and basically anyone who could have anything to do with suicide is supposed to be involved in their local area. But one of the things we know, think about all of those statistics, one of the things that we know is that we think we have underreporting of suicide. So the way here that a death is deemed suicide is that you have to have a criminal standard of proof for it to be deemed as such. And actually in many cases, roads being a really good example of that, if someone is driving down, we've got some small roads over here, if someone is driving down one of those country lanes at night, perhaps it's raining, perhaps they've had something to drink, is their death an accident or was it with intent? And that's one of the things that's very difficult to show over here, and one of the reasons we believe there is underreporting, particularly around roads. So as part of our work, we try to work with different industries to help them think about suicide prevention. So over here, rail suicide, there are around just 250 to 300 deaths on the rail network every year. So we have a large partnership with Network Rail and the wider rail industry, and we've had it for about 7 or 8 years now. And we take a coordinated national approach, which means we undertake research with them to try and understand more about why people take their own lives on the railway. We look at how we reduce access to means, which means trying to stop people physically being able to take their own lives on the railways, for example, through barriers, where that's possible. And again, we have a lot of rail track, and that obviously isn't possible everywhere, but for example, at platforms, trying to make it more difficult. But we also try and increase opportunities for intervention. So what that means is we have crisis signage that is available in some places where there is a high frequency location where people are trying to take their own lives. Quite a lot at that particular place will have crisis signage. And we also do a whole range of training for rail staff. So we've trained over 15,000 staff on the railway. And that might be people who, ticket collectors, people standing on platforms, helping people get on and off trains, a whole range of different staff. And what we're trying to help them do is have confidence to approach someone. If they're worried about someone on the platform, we're training them to give them confidence to go and talk to that person, ask how they're doing, see if they're okay. We also do large campaigns to try and get the general public to think about getting some help if they're struggling. And they might be large posters, but they might also be clips on social media. And you may have heard, well, you probably haven't, but if you Google Small Talk Saves Lives and Samaritans, you can have a look at our little clip there. And that's been a really successful campaign, which has reached over 15 million people. And of course, if there has been a suicide, we also provide support for those affected. So that may be sending our volunteers to the station, perhaps where it happened, but also we provide trauma training for managers, because we know certainly in a rail driver's life, train driver's life, that actually if they are driving that train or someone has tried to take their own life, that's a really traumatic incident for them, and of course all the witnesses. And we do a whole range of community outreach work which tries to basically stop people getting from the platform in the first place. So it tries to get people seeking help in their communities before they reach that crisis point where they want to take their own life. So we've been doing all of this work with the rail industry for several years. And when PAX came to talk to us about roads, we were really delighted, because what we wanted to do was think about how all of our work with rail could then be translated into the road industry as well. Does anyone, I think that's all I was going to say. If people have got questions, I'm really pleased to take them.
Oh, we do indeed. We've got some questions straight away. So Anjum's got one here. I'm interested in thoughts around why construction workers specifically are so representative in the stats. Is it just about socio-economic factors, or does the nature of the sector type or work, culture, etc. play a role?
Yeah, absolutely. We think it's a mixture of those things. So we think it's about low skilled work and having not a lot of control over your role and your job. You know, someone else is constantly telling you what you're doing as part of your day. And as you say, that socio-economic piece around lower paid. And we think there's something in that culture. So I don't know about over there, but certainly over here, you know, the construction industry can be a pretty stereotyped male culture where people don't talk, people don't want to, you know, and then they might not want to say they're struggling, they might not be reaching out for help. So that's one of the reasons we think that.
A question here from Adam. What is the trend in suicide numbers in Great Britain? Over the last decade in Australia, we've seen a growth from 1,833 to 2,348 between 2008 to 2017. But then for Wales, it's 2341 to 3120 over that time period.
So one of the things about Great Britain, or indeed the UK, is that the trends are different in each of our nations. So obviously UK split up into Scotland, Northern Ireland, England and Wales. So in England, we are seeing the rates overall come down. So what we have seen is that the male suicide rate decreased, for example, last year, and it's now the lowest rate since 2007. We've seen some small changes in the female suicide rate, where it's kept at a much lower level than the male rate, but it's been a little more up and down. And what we've seen is that, I say, it's really this group of middle-aged men, and indeed women, although slightly older than women, who are that highest risk group, and that has continued for some years.
Aaron's came back for a bit more of a clarification. He said the rate is 10.1 per 100,000 person. He's just wondering how that compares.
Sorry, say again?
10.1 per 100,000.
In Australia?
Yes.
So
we're pretty on the spot there for the stats.
No, that's good. That's good. It's very early for stats. So our male rate is 14 per 100,000. Our female rate is 4.6, and they're the England rates. And if you give me half a second, I can find out my overall rate. Our latest stats only came out a few weeks ago, so you know, I still don't have them completely off the top of my head. And our overall rate is 9.2 for England.
One other sort of question as well was, for rail workers, for the drivers, what sort of resilience and support programs are for them who are involved in a suicide?
So I'm not the expert in all the detail of that, because that's provided by the rail industry themselves. But what I do know is that we both provide training for managers of those drivers around trauma, and they will have an within the industry, they will have an employee assistance program whereby those drivers can get, for example, confidential counselling in-house. So I think over the last kind of 5 to 10 years, I think there's been a real increase in the amount of support that drivers can get, because people really recognise now that it's a really traumatic incident to witness a suicide, actually, and that it's really important that people put support in place. And we know that people over here will say that it's the most traumatic thing that could ever happen in their career. And for some drivers, they aren't able to drive again, even with support. It's very difficult.
Thank you. So a question here from Ron. Australian media does not generally mention suicides to avoid copycats. What is the policy in the UK?
So we do a lot of work actually with the Australians and others around this. So one of the things we know about media reporting of suicide is that if it's not responsibly done, so for example, if it contains details of method, then that can indeed increase, for vulnerable people, that can increase what you've called copycat suicide. But actually, if in the media they talk about hopeful stories of recovery around suicides, then actually that can increase help seeking. So we do a lot of work with media. Our view isn't don't report it. Our view is report it responsibly and show these hopeful stories of recovery, encourage help seeking, do some, simple things like at the bottom of an article around somebody struggling, always provide help details, for example, of a helpline like Samaritans or others. So yeah, we think it's important to talk about it, talk about the fact that in England, 1 in 15 adults have reported having suicidal feelings, or 1 in 5 adults actually, have reported having suicidal feelings, but talk about the positive, hopeful stories of recovery.
Wow. A question here from Melissa. She would like me to ask if the UK publicly report the number of suicides by road trauma. Well,
and maybe that brings us nicely, perhaps on to David, or a point, because that's what David's really going to talk about, is the difficulty in getting those numbers for roads and getting an accurate picture of that.
So I've got a couple on that one. I'll hold them on for a tick and just get these last 2 questions done, and then we'll move on if that's all right. Andrew's got a follow-up question. You may not be able to answer this. Interested in knowing what kind of training and the extent of the training provided to rail staff and the talk-down techniques used, and whether you're familiar with the assist model as an example.
Yeah, we are familiar with the assist model. We have our own bespoke training for the rail industry, whereby we both do day-long courses, but we also have a training tool with lots of different modules on it, like an online training tool, and that is very specific to the rail. So, for example, on that training tool, the sorts of video clips and things that are used are using rail industry staff, they're using the rail environment, so that the people on that training really recognise the place that they're in. And it has it has a whole set of things around helping people understand about suicide, as well as lots of role-playing things to help people talk about it, to help them approach somebody, to help them think about who they might approach and why. So a whole range of things in there.
Thank you. So last question here before we move on. David is asking, how are you able to collect the data to make the connection between suicide and the number of people who have a source of help prior to suiciding? I assume this data is quite difficult to obtain.
Yeah, so we obviously have a national statistics agency who pull together all the information around suicide. In terms of how many people have sought help, there are a whole range of different ways people might seek help over here. So, we have no way of collecting data on whether someone has asked a friend or a family member for help, but we have a number of proxy measures. So, for example, people who are accessing mental health services, for example, people who are calling our helpline, there's lots of different ways to do that. We don't have some really clever way, though, that captures everybody doing that.
Thank you very much. What we're going to do now is we're just changing to our other presenter. So there may be a small distortion while we're doing that, so please bear with us. And now we're changing over to David. All right, David, here you go.
Hello, good evening. hope you're enjoying daylight saving. I could just see the sun coming up here behind Westminster Abbey, so I hope you can now follow my part of the presentation. So Jackie's given us a great context, and I'd just like to share with you how it was that PACS got involved in this whole project and why we came to do this report. And it very much started with the Samaritans, because PACS is a transport safety organisation, and I sit on a rail safety body where I heard a presentation from the previous chief executive of the Samaritans talking about the excellent work they were doing to tackle suicides on the railways, and I thought, well, that's fantastic. It's a real success story. What's happening on the roads? And then we were fortunate enough to get some funding from the Road Safety Trust and Safe Roads Foundation, and Samaritans agreed to help us with this project and be our partners. And so we kicked off this research project to try and find out what was happening on the road network. And fairly early on, we realised there was a question earlier, I think, about what's the number of suicides that take place on the roads or connected with the roads, and there's no official number, there's no central database. It was clear also that it just was not identified as an issue. In fact, as I think a number of sectors find, there's often a resistance to recognising the issue, saying, well, that's to do with mental health, it's not road safety, and so on. And perhaps consequently, there was fairly limited collaboration and policy guidance and so forth, and limited research relevant to the roads. I mean, I think there's a lot of research into suicides in all sorts of ways, but not an awful lot about the roads, and certainly it wasn't getting through to the road safety community where PACS works. So we put together this research project, and the objective was essentially to try and find out what data is available, who the main stakeholders are, what initiatives and lessons from other sectors could be learnt. And the way we went about doing it to start with, it's a pity that Katie Harrison, who is a researcher, can't be sharing this with you today, but she's recently left PACS and she's gone to Highways England, and I'm sure she'll be taking on some of that work there. But so what Katie did was to send out freedom of information requests. We have a Freedom of Information Act in the UK, which makes it a requirement for public authorities to provide information. So we wrote to all the police forces, we wrote to the coroners, we wrote to local authorities, and we scoured the internet and various other things. We also set up an advisory panel with people like Jackie on it, people from the rail sector as well, and we ran some what we called expert workshops. And in relation to the freedom of information requests that we sent off, it was pretty evident that there was very limited data available. These numbers, I wouldn't worry about them too much, but all they demonstrated was that there was an issue. There were cases of suicides and certainly attempted suicides taking place in relation to the roads by one means or other, but the police forces were just unable to isolate the data, and we were quite surprised just how difficult and how impossible it was, in fact, for them to provide this information. They weren't being obstructive. Some were saying, look, we know we've got an issue, we'd like to help, but it would just be so difficult to trawl through all our police records and try and extract A, suicides or attempted suicides, and then B, those which relate to the roads. And similarly, the coroners, who of course only deal with the actual deaths, and Jackie's explained the problem of the standard of proof they're required to apply in reaching a verdict, but they came back, a number of them came back to us and said things like, I regularly deal with suicides on the roads, but sadly I've got no way of checking on the numbers, and obviously they wouldn't know anything about suicide attempts. But nevertheless, we did get some examples, anecdotes, or more than anecdotes, individual examples and some numbers to demonstrate that this was an issue, more in some places than others perhaps, but it was an issue, but we couldn't get a clear overall picture. Fortunately for us, otherwise our research might have been slightly scuppered, fortunately Highways England which is the body which is now responsible for our motorways and our trunk roads in England. They had commissioned research using an outfit called Road Safety Analysis, which PACS works with closely anyway, to look into the official mortality data which the Office of National Statistics hold, and a guy there called Bruce, which I think may be appropriate if you don't mind the joke. He scoured through 15 years worth of data, and you have to get special access to this data and sign all sorts of non-disclosure agreements and so forth. And Highways England kindly shared that information with us and allowed us to publish that in our report. And what they found, what Bruce found, was that he identified 392 cases of suicide or likely suicide in that 15-year period. So that's taking a slightly more broader definition than a strict suicide verdict of the coroners. But it's evident from the reports that in many cases it was highly likely that it was suicide, even if it couldn't be conclusively proven. And that gave the figure of around about 25 to 30 deaths a year in England relating to roads. And we then, scaling that up, for the United Kingdom, we think there are probably at least 50 deaths each year on the roads. Now, you know, you could say that's not a huge number in relation to the totality of suicides. Some, you know, Jackie was explaining that, nearly 6,000 a year. It's not a huge number in relation to the 1,800 road deaths, but nevertheless, it's still 50 deaths too many. It's 50 deaths that perhaps could be prevented, and it's 50 deaths we need to focus on. So PACS is not saying this is the biggest issue in the world for roads and road safety, but it's certainly one we should be aware of. So what's happening on the positive initiative side? Well, the government has a strategy on suicide, and I mean, Jackie will probably explain this better maybe later, but I think that the guidance has been amplified with regard to roads by Public Health England, which is a body which takes the government's policy and develops it into more of a local practice, local action plans with local government. Yeah, so sorry, the Stats 19, horribly titled review. Stats 19 is just the number of the form which the police use to record road crashes, road casualties. And currently, what happens is there may be a crash, maybe a death, the police record it. Subsequently, the coroners may decide this was a suicide, and if it has not yet been published, then they will delete it from the records because it's not considered to be road safety. Now, that may be perfectly correct, but we're saying, well, don't simply delete it and throw it away and forget about it all. Let's at least keep that data, those records, in a separate pile, a separate file, and we will at least have some information in that way. And there's now a review going on of that process in the context of a much broader review of road safety statistics. So that's positive. Highways England, they have launched their own strategy and toolkit on highways prevention on Highways England roads, set up a task force or working party, which actually is meeting tomorrow. And I think for me, the fact that the main highways authority in the United Kingdom has taken on board this issue and is seeing it as important is really important. It's very important because it vindicates our interest in this. We did get some comments about, well, is this important? Is this relevant? Is this road safety? Should we not be doing other stuff? And we stuck with it because we felt it was something that was worth highlighting. And as I say, the fact that Highways England have also taken this on and are seeing it through further, and I think working with Samaritans as well, that's very encouraging. And of course, for them, it's not just the tragedy of the deaths; it's actually the huge delays that suicide or a possibility of a suicide, someone on a bridge, for example, can bring to the motorway network. So they've got two aspects to their interest. And then there are a number of local suicide prevention groups which have taken up local issues and are working very well there. We just hear about them and give them a bit of context. And this report has generated a lot of interest and enthusiasm where we didn't really anticipate it. So I can talk perhaps a bit more about that later. But we've certainly had people come to us afterwards and say, what are you doing? How can we get involved? Can you tell us more about our sector? Generally, we pass them on to Jackie. So, but it has generated interest. So if I can just quickly run through our recommendations, they're all in the report, and it's not a long report. I think I would really encourage you to read it if you have got 20 minutes, half an hour. I mean, just look at the executive summary. But in terms of recommendations, we've recommended that the government recognise the specific issue of road-related suicide in its mental health policies and its road safety policies. And we think it's important that the government clarifies where this sits in terms of ministerial responsibilities. And we have suggested that actually the road safety minister should take on the primary role because there are overlaps with road safety. We endorsed changing the standard of proof. A number of other bodies have suggested that, and I gather that may actually now there may be changes coming in that regard. We can't claim any credit for that, but we just thought we would endorse that because, like Samaritans, we feel very much that this issue needs a lot more clarity and discussion and exposure. I mean, can I just chuck in a personal thing? I mean, I was really shocked at the scale of death by suicide when we first started researching this, and I think that's what has has sort of driven me to keep an interest in this issue. Three times the number of people take their lives by suicide than die in road collisions. So we have very much endorsed the need for more improved cross-sector cooperation, increasing awareness, and reducing the stigma surrounding road-related suicide. So as I was rather just saying there, talking about it more. Ideally, we'd like to see a central database created of suicides and suicide attempts. And interestingly, we never envisaged this, but some of the police contacts have come back and said, well, this could be a live database, so it could actually be helpful in ongoing incidents and live policing and interventions, not just some sort of historical record. Yeah, we've encouraged agencies to improve the recording systems. I was saying how little data we were able to get from the police, even though police obviously keep records of all sorts of incidents. And I think that's still work in progress. We haven't cracked that yet, but we have had some encouraging reports from individual police forces and so forth. And I think particularly around attempted suicides, because that's maybe 10 times the number of people who actually die. On the railways, the records are extremely good. It's the British Transport Police who deal with railway suicides have very good detailed record keeping on incidents and prevention and so forth. We don't have that in relation to roads. I've talked briefly before about reviewing the guidelines for recording road-related suicides in our road crash recording, so-called STATS 19, and then learning from the experiences of other sectors, the UK rail sector and other countries, notably Sweden. We connected with Dr. Anna-Lena Andersson in Sweden, where they've gone into great detail developing methods as to how to identify, classify suicides, and they found a substantial number, I think it was 10% of deaths on the roads, which they previously been classifying as road accident deaths, they're now classifying as suicide. So what next? Well, I just mentioned on the information from Jackie, I have to admit, the High Court apparently has suggesting, or has recommended lowering the standard of proof from criminal to civil, so that will probably increase the number of incidents recorded as suicide formally. Highways England is we're working with them on its strategy, there is guidance being provided by various agencies around high frequency locations, and we're trying to support the increase in the quality and effectiveness of local suicide prevention plans. So yeah, back to you guys.
Well, this is actually, there's a lot of questions here, so I'm going to draw them through, and I'll try and, there's some key themes coming out of it as well. So Lisa's asked a question here. Are there statistics around drivers of transport suiciding by their vehicle, as well as others driving, stepping into heavy vehicles, lorries, or using other mechanisms on the road?
There are statistics. They are somewhat buried away, and they're certainly not easy to access. You have to look at those detailed coroner's reports, which we don't have access to, or alternative. I mean, the police will know, but because when there's a death on the roads here, it's usually investigated in some depth by the police and serious collision investigation units. So there's a lot of knowledge there, but it's not brought together. And I must admit, one of the shocks to me when I started looking into this was, whereas in relation to road casualties, there are hundreds and hundreds of pages of analysis printed every year into the 1,800 deaths and 25,000 serious injuries and so on. The published information on suicides just sort of allocates it into 5 different categories, and I thought, what, is that it? You know, now obviously some people know an awful lot more than that, but it's not publicly available. I understand that about half the deaths that we are referring to relate to people jumping from bridges, but I'm also told there may have been a trend more recently towards stepping in front of trucks rather than jumping. Perhaps that's because bridges have been made more secure, but these data are rather sort of hidden away. On the railways, I'm sure they know it, but on the roads, we're still struggling really for clear information.
When you're going through the police data, because one of the questions here from Ron, and cross over with a couple of others, is asking, what about the differentiation between inattention and driving and distraction when they sort of drove themselves off the road at a high speed sort of areas? And did they all have the seatbelts in as well?
Again, this is getting into a level of detail which I'm afraid I really don't know. The government, well, on the positive side, our government, our Department of Transport, has launched a project into learning more from the police serious and fatal collision investigation files. And I think that's the kind of information which may well come out of it, because at the moment, one of the issues is that I think we're classifying some deaths as so-called road accidents, you know, traditional road safety, road crashes, when in fact they were probably suicide, probably deliberate. So we're looking at them in the wrong way, doing, you know, trying the wrong interventions, getting our figures wrong. But I mean, Jackie, anything you can help me out with there?
No, I think that's one of the problems really in the UK, is that still our information about it is very scant, and actually it's the work of David and Pax which has really helped us understand the scale of the issue a bit more. But now we need to really get under the skin of that. And as David says, there might be a range of ways of doing that, but really, you know, it's about then people going through coroner's records, a lot of that, and really understanding what happened. But I guess, well, one of the things to think about is, you know, we talk about suicide prevention being a really public health approach to this, because regardless of how the person actually took their own life on the road, you know, actually what we need to do is get people getting help sooner, so that they're not getting into that place in the first place. Because, you know, with all the road safety stuff that can possibly happen, it's still going to be possible for people to take their own life on the road network. We're not going to, it's a bit like the rail network, we're not going to be able to completely stop people being able to do that. So we have to look at other interventions as well.
And this is a good question to both of you from David. And you always know it's going to be interesting when someone says, David, please don't take offence. A question for Jackie. Does the PACS project help or distract us? Should we be focusing our resources into the overall suicide prevention strategies?
It's a really good question, because yes, so for us, you know, we're thinking about 6,000 deaths and even more attempts every year, you know, and roads, 50 of those. You know, should we be putting time into that, or should we be thinking about that broader piece? Well, actually, for us, the key is getting all the different sectors interested. So we think it's absolutely fantastic that David's done this piece, because it means he's talking to a whole, you know, a different language and a whole different set of people than we're used to. He's talking to all the road safety people. You know, they're not people that we would usually have been talking to within our kind of daily suicide prevention work. And we have a phrase here, which is suicide is everybody's business. And David is really making that true by talking to the road safety guys, getting them interested. You know, we had some really fascinating conversations when David started this work, and, you know, we held a number of meetings and workshops, and we really realised our language even is very different, you know, and we were using the same terms to mean completely different things. So actually it's really important that we get the people who are, you know, responsible for their bit of this engaging with it, understanding the issue and getting on with it. So yeah, we think it is a really important piece.
I'll just do a follow-up one here from Adam. I think it just answers this one as well. Is there a conflict between the Samaritans' advocacy for not reporting causation and building public understanding of the contribution of self-harm to the road toll?
Interesting question. I think we absolutely, so you know, it's the sort of thing we think about a lot in our, just thinking about our rail work. So how do we, for example, get people recognising that it's really good to talk, if you see someone in distress at a rail platform, you know, go and talk to them. How do we do that without raising attention on the fact that you can kill yourself by using rail as a method? So similar thing around roads. And we think the key is to do that sensitively and carefully and not talk about the detail of that. And I mean, self-harm is a whole, it's one of those phrases which I think even within this country people use very differently. So I'm sure how it translates across different countries, we use it very differently as well. And there's a whole nother debate around that. But, you know, I think the key is to get people recognising that, you know, certainly people who are struggling can show that in different ways, to always take any form of self-harm really seriously, regardless of what that looks like, and not get into the detail of real detail around method around that stuff.
Can I chip in there and just say, I mean, I think that is one of the things that PACS has come across and sort of struggled with a bit. You know, how much can we talk about this? Are we talking about it responsibly? Are we saying too much? You know, are we? But I think you know, we feel very much that it's an issue which needs raising, and so we've learned how to. At least I hope we've learned how to talk about it responsibly, correctly, and I think we've tried to share that with others. So one of the things what I've learned in this project is that we don't talk about committing suicide anymore. Firstly, because suicide is no longer an offence in the United Kingdom, never was in Scotland anyway. So it's that you cannot commit suicide, and the Samaritans quite rightly pointed out it's about taking your life. You know, so and I think we've helped spread that. And in terms of getting the message across, one of the biggest supporters we've had since we published the report has been the Road Haulage Association, the main truck drivers, truck business association in the United Kingdom. Thousands of members, thousands of truck drivers, thousands of businesses, and of course they have a lot of men working on their own, not all, you know, highly skilled or highly educated. Well, highly skilled in driving trucks, obviously, but away from home a lot, and it's an issue for them as as individuals, and also, of course, the tragedy of people maybe stepping in front of their trucks. So their chief executive has been a huge champion of this project and has been seeing it through.
There's a good follow-up question here from Anjum. In some organisation sectors, I've seen the word self-harm being used interchangeably with the word attempted suicide. Do you think this reflects a lack of understanding on the issue, or perhaps not recognising or owning the issue, or is it something else?
I honestly think you could do a whole another webinar around self-harm and how it's used, because it's a real, and it's a really good question, because it is a whole field of debate, and here we see the academics and research literature uses self-harm regardless of intent, so regardless of whether it's an attempted suicide or not. Whereas in normal parlance, everyday speak over here, you talk about self-harm and people don't mean attempted suicide particularly. So people see it very differently over here, and I think there's still, a whole probably another webinar on that, and I suspect it translates differently as well as in different countries as well. It's a difficult area, I think. But I mean, for us, it all comes down to if somebody is struggling and if they are showing that by self-harm, regardless of whether that's an attempt or not, if it shows they're struggling, then they need to get some support, and that's really important.
A question from Sarah. Are you able to comment on whether persons using the road network with suicidal intent target any particular type of vehicles, e.g. trucks?
Can I
don't
just
think we know that.
Yeah, I mean, I only know this sort of, if you like, anecdotally through conversations with police crash investigators. They say that in UK we don't have very many incidents of people deliberately driving into other vehicles, which I gather is a bigger issue in Australia. So I think that's not to say it doesn't happen, but I think it may be less of an issue in the UK than it is in Australia.
I was just wondering, on the coroner's reports, what sort of recommendations do they make recommendations regarding suicide?
Coroners can produce a prevention of future deaths report in relation to any death. Jackie, help me out on what they might say in relation to suicides. Because there's there are relatively few road ones, so
Yeah, and I think it might depend. So certainly if I think it would depend on the circumstances of that suicide. So for example, if it happened and someone was under the care of mental health services, or someone was within a government institution, so like a prison, there would certainly be a big review with recommendations around that. But I'm not sure that every instance really gets those recommendations out of it. And of course here, every coroner is independent, and so coroners may well, the extent to which coroners may do it may differ.
I'm not aware of any coroners' prevention of future death reports referring to suicide and roads. They do produce them on road safety issues occasionally, but I don't know of any regarding suicides.
Okay, just a couple more questions and we'll call it quits. Adam here has been asking one, given that 10% number of suicides in Sweden, how probable is it that the 50 deaths per annum is greatly understated in your report?
Well, we feel, and this is based on the work that Highways England has done, and advice from others, and just the way the reporting is managed, that 50 is very likely to be an underestimate. If you compare it with other countries, Sweden, Finland, etc., look at average suicide rates, it would look to be on the low side. And I think it could well be into three figures, but we're not trying to exaggerate it. We'd like to get the better evidence first.
That's fair enough. Do you believe the ON's closed data policy impedes the development of good road safety policy, do you think?
Sorry, Jerome, the ONS
the ONS. Yes. Do you think that impedes your data, your ability to have good road safety policy? Question from Adam.
Well, I think it does. I think that the lack of official statistics is very unhelpful. It's an unknown problem, and so a lot of people can say, well, you know, I know there were 1,800 deaths, which are classified as you know, road crashes, road casualties. They don't know how many there are on the roads which are suicides. So, you know, if it's not measured, it doesn't get done.
And here's a good question here from Tim. Will safe system road designs and accounting for mistakes of general road users also mitigate road suicides, do you think?
That's a very good point, because often we're asked, well, what can we do about it? Now we've identified this issue, what, apart from the much more broad work that Samaritan's doing and others doing, what can we do in relation to roads? And it does seem, and this is based on work from Sweden and elsewhere, that the safe system approach, lower speeds, safer vehicles, safe, more forgiving roadsides, is the kind of measure that you would take if you had a specific suicide problem in that area. So they're complementary.
And I guess this will be our sort of closing question now, because we have enjoyed hearing the bells in the background, that's for sure. We're about to kick off a discussion here to see if, to look at a similar project, really what PAX has done. It's really focused around what's been impacting our corporates and some of our organisations out on the road. What guidance do you have for us as we set out?
Please read our report.
I did.
Yeah, great. It wasn't a sophisticated methodology. We just you know, contacted as many people, as many organisations, looked at as many reports and databases as we could to see what information was there, and you know, you'll see where that leads you. I suspect the sort of research questions, that the strategic issues will be similar. You know, lack of data, can we improve data, can we improve reporting, who's involved, what do we do about it, what can we learn from other sectors, and then I think, you know, there will be stuff specific to Australia which will be interesting. There's a number of good researchers around the world as well who have been looking into this stuff. I mean, I think one of the problems is that often the mental health and public health and roads communities don't speak to each other enough, and that's something that we ran a conference which went extremely well, great, very emotional, but very good for cross-sector working, and we've been building from there.
Jackie, do you have any thoughts at all?
No, I mean, clearly, you know, support everything that David said. I think also just think about that suddenly, you know, from Samaritans, we're talking about suicide, you know, all day, every day. That's what we do, and we have good support systems in place. For road people, they're not, you know, this isn't how you know, what you talk about every day. And just think about actually the people that you're talking to and the support around it. Because you never know what's going on in somebody's life. You never know what people are struggling with, and you never know how people have been touched by suicide. So it's just bringing that sensitivity to the issue as well, and remembering ultimately, you know, this is about people, and a lot of people have been affected, and just, you know, bringing that sensitivity in as you do it too.
I guess that's a real key element. But prior to this coming along, have you ever really thought much about road safety at all, Jackie?
For us, no. So we had done a lot of work around high frequency locations, which of course may include some of the road network. But we hadn't thought about it through that lens of road safety in the way that David spends all of his time thinking about. And that's why it's a really nice collaboration, actually.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you both very much. Do you have any last closing words at all you'd like to share?
It's just been fantastic to do this, so thanks to you and Rosie and everybody else for taking part, and I'm sure we would have had some UK people joining us, except for the time of day. So we're very interested to hear what you know, where you go with this and what you learn, because, you know, we can learn from you.
Yeah, absolutely. We think it's great that you're doing this initiative. We're really happy to help where we can, you know, and if you've got other information that you want, do get in touch, and yeah, keep in touch and let us know how it's going. It's great.
Fantastic. Well, collaboration is one of the main goals with what we're doing. Thank you very much to our audience today. Big thank you to Jackie and to David getting up in the early hours of the morning over in the UK to share their story and their journey with us. And we'll certainly keep them in the loop as we move forward. So thank you all. Have a lovely evening and join us for the next webinar. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.